So let's do a review of what we learned in equipment last time. So I am going to draw on real quick. All right, so we have our main magnet here. In most of our clinical sites, what type of magnet are we dealing with? Superconducting. How are our coils in the superconducting? How are they aligned? What's their shape? They look like a spring, straight.
More like a spring.
More like a spring. Solenoid coils. So this is kind of what they look like. And they number turns, and how close those turns are basically give us our magnetic strength. Usually we apply some kind of voltage into our coils here. That's going to be our process of ramping up the magnet. And we need to apply a current within these coils, and then we need to quench it off, because usually once our voltage, once we've got it up to a certain amount of voltage, we can quench it off, and then we basically surround these solenoid coils by liquid helium, which keeps those coils extremely cold, which reduces our resistance down to zero, right? So that way we don't have to keep applying power into our superconducting magnet, so we can keep those operational costs down, okay? So if we had to show the different components of the magnet, starting with our patient. Here's our patient right in the middle here. From the inside out, give me the different layers. So starting this layer right here. Closest to the magnet. Alright, good. Let's increase the size of it. It's our radio frequency. Alright, what's the next layer?
Radiant.
Gradient can be also time-varying magnetic field. All right, what's the next layer?
Channel.
And then our final layer?
Main magnet.
Good. Main magnets.
Yeah.
Yellow's kind of hard to see, but main magnet. All right, so we start off with the RF magnet. This is where we're applying an oscillating radio frequency pulse at the Larmor frequency of our hydrogen spins. Due to resonance and precession, we can flip those hydrogen spins to oppose the static magnetic field, and it flips it into the transverse plane, and that's how we get our signal, because it reads out in the transverse plane. We have our receiver coils. Our RF coil is located usually within the bore of the magnet, and it's sometimes called the body coil, because you have a transmit RF coil already built in to the magnet, and that's typically called the body coil. So that runs basically the entire length of the magnet. Our body coil pretty much looks something like this. So our body coil is responsible for applying energy to a certain range of frequencies, usually what we call our transmit bandwidth. And those ranges of frequencies can be large or small depending on if we want a thick or a thin slice. And then we actually have what we call receiver coils that we actually place on the patient. So if we have a receiver coil, say it's an abdomen, and we just put a receiver coil 90 degrees to our static magnetic field, these receiver coils collect or read out the signal coming from the patient. So you have all different types of coils within the MR system. You have surface coils, you have volume coils, phased array, quadrature. We'll talk about those today. Shim, or let's go to the next one. Gradient coils. What do the gradients do? What's their main responsibility? I'll put it down here. What is the main responsibility of our gradient coils?
How long is
Spatial localization. This is where we're applying those gradients in all three orthogonal planes. Okay. From head to toe, usually our Z gradient is applied, gives us our axial slices. From A to P, usually gives us our coronal slices. So this is anterior, this is posterior. This right here is going to be our Y gradient. Right of the patient. We're looking at their feet. This is the left of the patient. This is going to be our X gradient right here, right to left. A to P, Y gradient gives us our coronal. X left to right gives us our sagittal. And then from the foot to the head of the patient, that is our Z gradient, and that gives us our axial slices. So spatial localization, that's what the gradient coils are responsible for. Basically applies a positive, adds a little bit more voltage on one end, and then you have a negative on the other. Okay? So that you get, at isocenter, right in the middle of the magnet, isocenter, you have exactly 42.57 megahertz, right? If you're at 1 Tesla. Precessional frequency. But then as you go, you get a linear slope. And so at the head of the magnet, you're going to get a higher precessional frequency as opposed to the feet of the magnet. And this happens in all three planes.
head is always more positively charged?
Typically, I guess, but it doesn't have to be. You could apply it the opposite direction. All it's doing is just, it's giving us a linear curve. It could be going from negative or positive to negative the other way, but typically it is head to toe, and it's usually more positive than negative. All right, shim coils. What's the shim responsible for?
Raise an even homogeneous.
Field homogeneity. So we want the entire magnet to be 1.5 Tesla or whatever. The entire length of the bore. We don't want any variations unless we're applying the gradients, obviously. We want the field strength to be 1.5 Tesla from head to foot. Remember, unless we're applying the gradients. So field homogeneity is usually measured in, do you remember the units for homogeneity?
BPM.
BPM. And typically you want to be, if the engineer and the physicist want to get it below, what? What was the below 4 ppm? For it to be ready to go for scanning patients. If we have a very homogeneous magnet, we get great fat saturation. And then the main magnet, that just is really, whether it's 1.5 or 3 Tesla, whatever your field strength is, or our static magnetic field. Remember, 3 Tesla, usually we get more spin ups than we get spin downs, so we get a greater net magnetic vector to start with 3 Tesla compared to 1.5. So we get more signal to start with, and we can play around with our resolution. So we talked about these 3 things, so we're really going to hit on RF, and that will be it today. When we were talking about the gradients, we had a couple definitions we needed to know. What were those definitions?
Straight.
Slew rate was one. Good.
Strength.
Amplitude or strength. Speed, right? And then what was that last one?
Duty cycle.
Duty cycle. There you go. You know the units for each one? Speed, microseconds. Gradient strength could be either Tesla or what? Huh?
No Tesla per meter Gauss specifically.
Okay. And then the slew rate, you just basically that divided by seconds again. So it's typically in terms of Tesla meter per second. And remember, with our cardiac pacemakers, you want it below what? Your slew rate.
200.
Yep, less than 200. Good. And then duty cycle is the percentage. That's how long the gradients are working. Good. So shim, field homogeneity, less than 4 parts per million, gives us good fat saturation. Gradient magnetic fields give us our spatial localization in all 3 orthogonal planes, where we apply more voltage to one end of the magnet and less voltage towards another end of the magnet. Gives us our linear slope. Right in the middle of the magnet is isocenter. Our shim coils, we already talked about that. And our main magnet is just our static magnetic field. And like I said, we'll talk about the RF coil, body coil here in a second. Everybody got that written down? You can save this one. All right, so last time, when we talked about RF shielding, we had to talk about how we had to prevent random radio frequencies from getting in the room. What was that? How do we start? What was the material we used to surround the room? Copper. It's also called the Faraday cage. A lot of the times nowadays we're not using copper as much just because it's more expensive and heavier than aluminum. So they're going towards aluminum nowadays, but copper was the gold standard for a while. And you'll see most rooms still have it. But if it's been cited within the last couple of years, they're starting to use aluminum panels more than copper. If you have any type of observation window, I think you can't put copper in the actual window. What's going on there is they use a wire mesh or what we call a honeycomb filter, and this absorbs or even reflects those radio frequency waves from the outside coming in. So it's a wire mesh or a honeycomb filter within the observation window, or if there's maybe a little vent for where the air condition is, prevents any outside RF pulses in the room. We talked about how the gradient coils give us our spatial localization, and here are our 3 axes. And then we have the z-axis, which gives us our slice selection in our transverse or axial plane. And then you have your x and y, which gives us our phase encoding and frequency encoding directions. Do you remember which one we typically want to have the shorter length of the anatomy? The phase or the frequency? The phase, because remember the phase encoding direction is part of our scan time equation. Scan time equals TR times the number of phase encodings times next. So if we can keep this phase encoding direction as small as possible, that will keep our scan time down. And then we define all 3 of these before. So our gradient strength, gradient speed, slew rate, and then our duty cycle. Alright, so we're on RF coils. So our RF transmitter, this is what usually flips our net magnetic vector from V sub 0 into the transverse plane V1. It's the closest component to the magnetic core or our patient. The body coil is part of our main magnet, and that's used for transmitting and receiving signal. And this is typically how most scanners in hospitals are constructed, with this RF body coil already built in. Some scanners will have a transmit-receive coil that you can actually place on the patient. These could be transceivers for the head, body, or the extremity. So if you have here the term transceiver, that these coils can transmit and receive signal. Since the body coil, or that big transmit coil, is already built in the scanner, most MR systems use those receiver or surface coils to collect our signal. So most of those coils you see being placed on the patient are typically just receive coils, where they're just receiving the signal. So let's talk about some types of receiver coils. First, we have a quadrature coil. This is where we have 2 receiver coils that are perpendicular to one another. And we have quadrature head coils most of the time. This is going to increase our signal by 40%, or almost times 4, because with coils that are perpendicular to each other, we actually square whatever signal we're getting. So we're going to increase it on both dimensions. So typically we're increasing our signal by 4. This is not only applying 2 RF pulses, but we're going to be now capturing 2 free induction decays. So as if we apply 2 RF pulses, we get 2 free induction decays, and that's our signal, right? So this is an image of a quadrature coil here for GE, and then this is how they're typically set up and look. They're just at 90 degrees from each other, those 2 coils. So this is great for really increasing the amount of signal we're getting from our patient. A phased array coil, this is where we have smaller surface coils, and surface coils are great because you can usually put them on the patient, and the size of a coil, the smaller the coil, you actually get more signal from. So if you have a big volume coil that takes up the entire abdomen, you actually get less signal from those coils than you get from the smaller coils. So this is using kind of the best of both worlds, where they have smaller coils, and they're basically built so that they're one after the other, and that's why they call it phased array. And so you get the higher signal, but then you also get the increased volume of tissue that you're able to cover. So a lot of these spine coils are what we call linear phased array coils, where we're getting greater volume of coverage and higher signal. And we can actually turn on, say, section 1 and section 2 and then turn off the other sections. Or we can turn on sections 4, 5, and 6 and turn off the other sections. So depending on what part of the spine we're imaging, you select the section of that phased array coil. Okay? So you're just utilizing, say, section 1 and section 2 for the C-spine, and then as you go down the spine, the T and L, you just turn on those coils. What's also great about phased array is we're able to turn on what we call our parallel imaging. And parallel imaging reduces the amount of scan time because we're actually filling each line of K-space with their corresponding coil. So it reduces scan time immensely. So just remember, phased array, we're using basically what we call single loop coils, and we're basically lining them up one after the other to get greater coverage. And you can turn on those single loop coils to excite different areas of the body.
You say that needs to get a better...
So we get better signal, more coverage in phased array. Quick little synopsis. Those volume coils that you put on the patient, they do get decent signal, but what they're great at is getting really homogeneous field. So those volume coils, their benefit is you're getting a very homogeneous signal. But their signal is not as good as smaller surface coils. So it's really important to place these surface coils on the patient very close to the body part. So that's why typically when we have surface coils, we already have they're already shaped and designed for that body part. So you'll see like a knee coil that almost fits perfectly for a knee, or a shoulder coil that wraps around the shoulder perfectly. Because it's really important that we get the coil as close to the body part as possible. The diameter, the smaller these coils, the better. So if, say, we have a 10 centimeter diameter coil, here's just like a small surface coil. Diameter here, say 10 centimeters. We're going to get really good signal, but then it actually penetrates the part, meaning it goes tissue depth. So if this is the middle, it goes down into the tissue, we get signal from almost 5 centimeters to 7 centimeters. So usually 50% to 70% of that coil diameter is how far down that signal will go into the tissue. So we'll just put over here. depth, usually 5 to 7 centimeters. Okay, so 50% to 70% of that diameter of that coil. And then having a multiple coil system gives us better signal. So our quadrature and our phased array coils will give us better signal, and with our phased array gives us better coverage. So that's why it's kind of, if a patient is having a lot of pain, say, you have your spine coils usually built within the table. If you put them on some kind of padding, you're putting that patient's body part further away from those coils, and you're not going to get as much signal from that body part. You see that? So that's why it's like you have a patient that's really in a lot of pain and can't really lay flat. Sometimes that's a negative because you can't really add too much padding, and you won't be able to get the amount of signal that you need to image that body part. All right. So then let's just talk about last little bit our MR system hardware. So just basically everything surrounding the board of the magnet. So our instrumentation, we have the gantry, or called the board in MRI, gantry, CT, more likely term. You have your MR table, which can be taken out of the room, detached, the operator interface, and the computer. What kind of magnet do we have here? Open. How is our flux line? Is it vertical or horizontal? It's a vertical flux line. Yep. Any of these open systems, our flux lines are going to be vertical. Stronger Tesla strength than our superconducting, or less Tesla strength? Less. Usually about 0.2 to 0.4 Tesla. But these are great for our claustrophobic patients. Desmond, you have a question? Claustrophobic, any type of, say, IR procedure where they need to insert those catheters while they're imaging, or any type of actual movement imaging, so maybe you have to flex the bicep tendon as you're imaging, relax it, flex it. All those type of studies would be great with an open system. Once again, this is just kind of a quick recap. Really good students choose MRI. And then, Jasmine, what was your saying again? For the...
Something stars.
Yeah, the other way around. Yeah. It started with an M.
It went backwards.
It went backwards.
Something starred.
You said you saw it on the module. It was on the module.
Many stars glow radiant.
Oh, you wrote it down.
I wrote it down.
Many stars glow radiant. Awesome. All right, our transport system, which can be detached, usually a hydraulic or mechanical lift couch or table raises the patient to the level of the magnetic board. Because remember, our magnetic board is not going to change, right? So with our GE system, there's usually a pedal that releases the table from what pulls the table into this isocenter. So you have to make sure to detach that, drop the table down, make sure all the coils are unattached so the patient can get on, and then you basically raise the table up, and then it'll go back into the board. Siemens, usually you can detach the table right at the height of the bore of the magnet and then take it out. They're just, small differences between the two manufacturers. Most of the time, the transport system or the table actually provides attachment sites to these coils, so sometimes you can actually plug the coils into the table. That's more of a Siemens thing. GE, they have that hub that actually is in the middle of the board, but at Siemens tables, you can actually plug the coils right into the table. But that's also one extra step you have to do when you take the table out. You have to unplug all those coils too. Our operator interface, this allows techs to set up our sequence parameters. So this is where we're selecting our pulse sequences and changing our parameters, our extrinsic parameters. We can communicate with our patient both visually and verbally. So we always have to give them a call button and check in with the patient ever so often through our intercom. This also gives us our ability to post-process, so we can do our MIPing, our MPR, multiplanar reconstruction, or our MIP stands for maximum intensity pixel. So have you guys seen when they cut out the circle of Willis, and then they spin it, and then they tumble it? Sometimes they do that just to really visualize just the circle of Willis structures, and then they cut out all the saturated tissue, like the brain and the eyes and all those things, so that they can really see the circle of Willis really well. And then NPR is basically you acquire like a sagittal slice, and you have isotropic voxels. What does isotropic mean again? Equal on all sides. So the dimensions of that voxel are all equal, all three sides. So if you acquire a sagittal slice, you can reformat it in the coronal and the axial. So you almost get three planes for the price of one. So that's what MPR means, multiplanar reconstruction. So this is where you do that post-processing. You can send images to CAD. Does anybody know what CAD does? So typically for prostates and breast imaging, you send it to CAD. And CAD is really just kind of an algorithm, kind of like artificial intelligence, where it helps the radiologist locate certain things and kind of highlights or segments tumors, things like that.
And it's computer aid.
Diagnostic.
Thank you.
Can be touch screen or mouse driven. Most of them are mouse driven. Touch screen, as I feel like, would be getting a lot of trouble with a touch screen MRI console. All right, the computer. So most MR systems use a mini computer, have a large storage capacity, and able to do multiple calculations very fast. So every so often you do have to start erasing some of these exams because usually they do have a very large storage, but you do have to slowly erase some of these scans from months ago. So just be mindful or else your system starts to lag. The computer houses the array and image processors. It also houses the pulse control unit. So our pulse control unit, think of all our different pulses, our radio frequency pulse, our gradient. You can say your gradients are kind of like pulses. They're being applied at different times, and that creates our pulse sequence. It's kind of like a recipe for a dessert or something like that. Your pulse sequences are basically all the different timings of those RF pulses. So within this pulse control unit, it's responsible for sequencing gradients and RF coils. Control switching of gradient amplifiers at appropriate times. So that's how we get the more positive and negative end. You're supplying or turning off and on those gradients and applying those amplifiers. Pulse control unit monitors the RF transmission. We have to keep within the FDA guidelines. What does RF transmission do? Increases our what? Our SAR, which stands for, what's SAR stand for? And we remember the FDA sets those guidelines, so remember whole body, 4 watts per kilogram over 15 minutes, usually less for like the globes of the eyes and the glands. The last thing it does, it amplifies our free induction decay signal before sending it to the array processor for our Fourier transformation. array and image processors is the FID is the raw data sent to the array processor. The array processor performs complex multiplications called fast Fourier transformations. So just remember that the fast Fourier transformations is housed within the array processor. That's typically what they're going to ask you on the registry. So this is where it creates the fast Fourier transformation, a mathematical procedure converting signal in time domain to the frequency domain. So highlight this image here. So the fast Fourier transformation, you go from the time domain, where we get those different wavelengths, and then it transfers the signal into what we call a frequency domain. So we'll see how many times that particular tissue shows up in that voxel. And you'll get a peak with that value for that particular tissue. So then the image processor uses data from the array processor to assign each pixel a shade of gray. So, summary of this slide, the fast Fourier transformation is housed within the array and image processor, and what it's responsible for doing is putting signal from the time domain to the frequency domain. So this is what it looks like, the raw data within K-space. Typically the middle of K-space is going to be our signal and our contrast. And then the periphery of K-space is going to be our resolution. So make sure to write that one down. So here in the middle of K-space, the red is going to be our SNR and our contrast. And then everything on the outside here. That's going to be our spatial resolution. So our signal over here, which is a T1 weighted image, most of our signal comes from our fat and our white matter here. So all this sometimes gets put over here, but not necessarily the signal from the middle gets put to the signal of the middle of the image. You see that? So some of that white could be on the periphery out here, but that's just where the signal is. But then the spatial resolution, which is our detail, is out here. That's what gives us we're able to differentiate one structure from another structure. Okay? So this is K-space. Which is basically where we house all our signal. And then we put it through the fast Fourier transformation, which is just that complicated mathematical process which you don't need to know. And it creates our MR image. Okay? But just remember, the middle of K-space represents our signal and our contrast, and then the periphery of K-space represents our spatial resolution. In your K-space, sometimes we have on the horizontal row, those are your phase encoding direction. And then down here would be our frequency. And it really is just like a big grid. Big old matrix. You got all the lines of K-space. with a spin echo pulse sequence, each TR period fills a line of K-space. If you have a fast spin echo, where you're filling multiple lines of K-space, where your echo train length is longer, you fill multiple lines of K-space. That's why it's faster. Our signal typically looks like where it peaks out like that. Higher amplitude. And it's also with our frequency direction. It has lines like this. The K-space is very symmetrical also. So typically, the signal in the top of K-space equals the signal in the bottom of K-space. The signal in the left of K-space equals the signal in the right. So it's very symmetrical. So sometimes, with certain pulse sequences, where they call it zero fill, where they'll actually acquire a pulse sequence and they'll get data for the first half of K-space, and then they'll just basically either copy the data that they've already received and then fill the bottom, or they'll just put what we call zeros in the bottom. And that just speeds up our pulse sequence. We'll cover that later on, but just kind of give you So that is really it for this unit. Is there any questions?
What if the person is like really, really big and they can't fit inside the machine? Well,
Yes.
No, it's a good question.
Oh, well,
Yeah, we have limits, and it's sometimes it's tough to really tell if somebody's going to fit because they could be past the weight limit, but they're really long and slick. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So a lot of times the hardest patients to scan within the boards are short and stout because they don't really have anywhere to put their arms. But there are other ways that to kind of get them in there. You can put their arms over their head. You could go in feet first. You can kind of figure out different ways to get them in there. But sometimes they'll just need to go to a facility that's open,
yeah.
or they'll have you'll always have like the diameter of your board, so that you have an idea of how big they are. At some places, they even have like a circle that they can take up to the floor and say, "Are you going to be able to fit in this?" I mean, instead of bringing them down and trying to put them in there.
Someone told me that they had a lady was really big and they had to send her to the aquarium with the whales in. I mean, it's not funny. It's how you